Hello everyone and welcome to the Knowledge Pool, your source for everything regarding the rules of Magic the Gathering. And today we'll be talking about Sagas, the most infamous enchantment type. So let's begin with the card breakdown. First of all, Saga is an enchantment subtype, and the orientation of the card differs from most Magic the Gathering cards. Namely, we have still the name and the mana cost on top, then where we will have just the image of the card, there is a split where on the left side we have the rules text and on the right side there is the image, and finally on the bottom there is the typing of the card. Now, those abilities of the Saga with the Roman numerals are called chapter abilities, and in the rules explanation we explain how we get to trigger them. For the rules explanation we have to start with the basics for the Sagas. There is a simple reminder text on the top of the card, but it doesn't actually explain how they work. So, Sagas are associated with lore counters. That's the way they advance to the next chapter abilities. The way they obtain the lore sagas is as follows. First, every time the saga itself enters the battlefield, it enters with a lore counter on it. That is a replacement effect, because it enters with. Whenever a lore counter or more than one lore counters are placed on a saga, we need to check how many of those are placed and how many chapters they correspond to. So for example, when we play a saga like Befriending the Moths, it enters the battlefield with one lore counter, so we get to trigger the chapter 1 ability of the saga. Now, at our main phase, essentially, without saying it's at the beginning of our pre-combat main phase, it's a turn-based actions which cannot be responded to. All the sagas the active player controls get a lore counter on them, which means they advance their abilities. Now, when the final chapter ability resolves, after the ability resolves and is removed from the stack, the saga is then put into its owner's graveyard as a state-based action. That's important for later. We'll go to some tricks you can do with the sagas. You need to remember that as long as the final ability is still on the stack, the saga is not put into the graveyard. One thing to keep in mind is that we need to pay attention to the chapter abilities, because some are overlapping. So for example, in Befriending the Moths we can see that there is a 192 on the first ability. That means that this ability is the same for the first and the second chapter. So when we play Befriending the Moths, we get to do the ability, and then when a counter is placed on it, we get to do the ability again because it's the second chapter. Now, an important thing to note about sagas is that based on the rule 715.2b, the effect means that if one or more counters are placed on a saga, we trigger all of the corresponding chapters equal to the numbers placed. For example, let's say we have a Vorinclex Monstrous Raider on the side of the board, and we play the Fall of Lord Conda. That saga will enter with 2 counters instead of 1, because of Vorinclex's ability. That means that we get to trigger both chapter 1 and chapter 2 at the same time, and because we control the triggers and they trigger on the same event, which is the saga entering the battlefield, we get to put them on the stack in whatever order we want. So we could either first choose to exile creature and then gain control of all the things, or do the opposite order. Also, one very interesting thing is that if a saga somehow loses all of its abilities, it's considered to have chapter 0, so no chapters, as the final chapter. Therefore, if the saga loses all the abilities, it will be sacrificed immediately, even if it doesn't have any lore counters on it. Finally, all the new sagas from Kamigawa Neon Dynasty are double-faced cards, and that's because their final ability always causes them to be exiled and then return as a creature. The reason for that is not quite explicit, but it's mostly for 2 reasons. One, if they wouldn't exile themselves first and then return, they could attack on the same turn, because it would still be the same permanent, where now they need to have haste in order to either activate their abilities or attack on the same turn. They are exiled and returned, and also if they didn't exile the same, they will have to carry the lore counters on them, and that's just not very intuitive, because you have lore counters on a permanent with no apparent reason for it. Also, there is an enchantment saga, which is Urza Saga, but I'm going to be mentioning it on this video because I plan to do a separate video on it, since it has a lot of neat niche interactions and is also the most played card of all the sagas. And now let's examine some very interesting situations and rules interactions you can do with your sagas. First up, let's begin with the Eternal Saga. Here we'll teach a way that you can use to keep your sagas around basically forever. So, let's say you have a saga like the Eldest Reborn on 2 counters, and we go to our pre-combat main phase, and as a turn-based action, the 3rd counter is placed. Now, this will cause obviously the 3rd ability of said saga to trigger. Now, remember, if there is an ability of a saga still on the stack and the number of lore counters equal or exceed the maximum number of chapters, the saga is not sacrificed until that ability has left the stack, as per rule 7.15.4. What that means is that with the ability of the stack, if we use an effect like clock spinning or hex parasite to remove counters, we can set the counters back to 2, and what will that do is that after the ability resolves, so in the case of Eldest Reborn, to put a creature or planeswalker from graveyard to the battlefield under our control, the game will check and we see that our saga has 2 counters and not 3, which is the amount it needs to have to be sacrificed. That way we can keep any saga around by essentially hiking the ruling that says that if the ability is on the stack, the saga is not sacrificed. Then we have I can do this all day. So similar to the previous segment, here we teach a way to be able to reuse your saga abilities over and over and over again. So again, the way you trigger the saga abilities is by putting lore counters on them. Now, what can we do if we want to get an ability twice, other than of course copying the trigger? What can we do is, before we go to our main phase where this lore counter will be placed, we can remove a lore counter with a way like hex parasite or clock spinning. If we do that, the saga will be reset to 1 counter less. So let's say you have the Binding of the Old Gods. It's already on its 1st chapter because that's the enter the battlefield effect. And now we are on our upkeep and we want to destroy another permanent an opponent controls. We can use clock spinning, hex parasite, thrall parasite, or an effect like that to remove a counter from it. That will cause it to go to 0 counters, and then the saga will get a counter because it doesn't need to be chapter 1 to get counters. Get counters as a state-based action. So that way you can essentially modular the saga turn-based action to place counters and get the abilities we want. So part 3 is let's speed it up. So let's say we want to accelerate the progression of a saga in order to get to the most useful ability, or maybe get to the graveyard run to get it back. How can we do that? Well, as we said in the rules video, sagas are associated with lore counters. Lore counters are what make the chapter abilities trigger. So let's say we have a free action script, so we want to get to the 2nd chapter, which is the board wipe effect. We can play it, give a counter to a creature, then if we find a way to add a counter, a lore counter specifically, so that will be done with clock spinning because it both adds and removes counters, or with a proliferate effect, we can get the 2nd chapter earlier. Also, if we had an effect that allows the saga to enter with more counters on it, or generally allowed us to put more counters on it on the stack, we get both effects at the same time, and we get to stack them as we want. Remember, if there is a chapter ability still on the stack and the saga has reached the maximum amount of chapters based on the counters it has, the saga is not sacrificed until it leaves the stack. So let's say we had a Peer and a Voriclix on board, and we play the saga, we get all of the chapters at once, stack the as we want, and the saga would only go to the graveyard after the final stacked ability has resolved, regardless if it's the third chapter ability or the first. Up next is the big nonbo, something you don't want to do because it will be very, very sad. So as we mentioned, sagas have chapters, and if a saga somehow loses all its abilities, it has chapter 0 as its final chapter, which means it has chapter 0 and 0 counters or 1 or more counters. The counters are more than the number of chapters, so it will be sacrificed. Now, how can this happen? Let's say you have Opalescence and you make all your sagas creatures. Great. Let's say you say, okay, we'll play Humility because I still want to screw over my opponent's creatures. Now that will screw over you. Humility might set the power toughness as 1-1, but because the abilities of the cards are removed, the sagas have no abilities, and so they will all go to the graveyard. So be careful using Humility and Opalescence, or you'll be very, very sad. Part 5. The Great Reset. So let's say we want to actually start over with our sagas. What can we do? Well, if we actually manage to link our sagas with, say, Yorion, we get to reset them to chapter 1. If we return them to hand and cast again, we again can reset them to chapter 1. Keep in mind that the first protection won't quite do it because phasing out doesn't actually remove the counters and they don't count as entering the battlefield again, so we just say on the same chapter as they are. Also, one neat thing you can do if you can time it correctly, let's say you can give your Yorion flash and you wait to get all your chapters to chapter 3 or 4, depends on the final number. You can flash in your Yorion with the saga ability on the stack and blink them and save them. Finally, part 6, history wasn't always fun. So, you don't know if you know this, but lore counters actually existed before sagas were a thing. For example, there are 3 cards, Mind Unbound, Meteorize, and Scroll of the Masses, that associate themselves with lore counters. Now, these lore counters are exactly the same as the saga lore counters, which means that if you can transfer counters from it, like say with a Fate transfer, or if you can actually make them into copies of the sagas, they will have all of those lore counters on them, and then you get to trigger the corresponding abilities of the sagas. It's just a fun thing to do, just to mess up with your opponents, or to kind of take advantage of the same name of counter on the permanents. So these are sagas. I hope this video helped you understand the confusing reminder text of the sagas and how they actually work. Please, if you have any questions or any interactions that I have missed, leave them in the comments below. Thank you very much for watching. See you in the next video.